Imagine looking up at the sky on a cloudless summer afternoon, and instead of that brilliant natural blue you've known your entire life, the sky is just this hazy, permanent, milky white.
Right. Just a constant dull white.
Yeah, and the reason it's white isn't because of smog from a local factory or something. It's white because a fleet of hundreds of specialized aircraft has been flying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just indefinitely, spraying millions of tons of sulfur into the stratosphere.
It's a completely manufactured atmosphere.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. You know, usually when you face a global crisis, there's this underlying expectation that the brightest minds in the room are going to engineer a clean solution for you.
Yes, the technological savior complex.
Right. You think of the Apollo missions or like the global eradication of smallpox.
Mm.
You expect precision, you expect a cure. But today, we are stepping into the completely unregulated, terrifyingly real world of geoengineering and climate intervention.
And we need to set the parameters for this discussion right now because this is not a hopeful topic.
No, I need to be completely straight with you right out of the gate. Today's mission is not to look for silver linings. We are not here to hand out hope. We are acting as critical historians and investigative analysts, and our job today is to construct a black balance sheet.
A rigid, uncompromising audit of the facts.
Exactly. We're basically looking at humanity's ultimate Hail Mary pass, but the ball is filled with lead and we're throwing it at our own windows.
That is exactly the framework we must operate within today. We are looking at a compounding crisis where decades of failed climate mitigation have birthed this desperate, completely unregulated industry of planetary manipulation.
Yeah, it's panic mode.
Precisely. We are moving from a state of failing to protect the ecosystem into a state of actively weaponizing it against ourselves. But to build this black balance sheet, we cannot rely on speculation. I mean, every single claim we discuss today, every terrifying scenario is grounded in verifiable documentation.
We have the receipts. Walk us through the exact sources we're auditing today.
Right. So we were pulling from a massive 2024 report by the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIO, on the localized toxic risks of geoengineering.
Okay, the 2024 CIO report.
Got it. We are also auditing a deeply alarming scientific preprint from the journal Geosphere, dated January 5, 2026.
Brand new data.
Yes, very recent. And then we will look at a rigorous sociological data analysis from Cambridge University researchers. That one was published in the iScience Journal on March 17, 2023.
So we have the hard science and the sociological impact.
Exactly. We also have an official public enforcement notice issued by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on April 15, 2025.
Wait, the EPA actually had to issue a violation notice for this?
Yes. We will get into the details of that. It's quite severe. And finally, we will trace the systemic collapse of oversight using a comprehensive governance history published in Environmental Science. Atmospheres in June 2025.
Okay, so we have the hard science, the legal frameworks, the government violation notices, and the sociological data. And if we're going to audit how we got to the point where humanity is literally talking about changing the color of the sky, we have to start with the people who are supposedly in charge.
Well, that's the primary issue. No one is actually in charge.
Right, because there was a massive review published recently in that June 2025 Environmental Science Atmospheres Journal, and it basically read like an autopsy of global climate law.
An autopsy is the perfect word for it. It's a record of structural failure.
You look back at the 2009 UK Royal Society report, or the 2010 Asilomar Conference scientists back then were looking at this technology and realizing they needed to lay down some serious ground rules before anyone actually pulled the trigger.
Yes, the 2010 Asilomar Conference is a perfect example of this systemic failure. It was actually named after the famous 1975 conference that set safety guidelines for recombinant DNA research.
Oh, so they were trying to copy that success. Like, hey, we regulated DNA, let's regulate the sky.
Exactly. The scientific community hoped to establish basic principles, things like ensuring public participation and establishing independent assessments before any chemicals were put into the air or the ocean.
Sounds perfectly reasonable. So what went wrong? Why did the international community just structurally fail to build a rule book?
It failed because the international mechanisms we rely on for global consensus are fundamentally unequipped to handle unilateral, planet-altering technologies. Translating voluntary scientific principles into binding international law requires political will, and that will simply did not exist.
Give me some concrete data on that failure.
Let's look at 2013.
Mm-hmm.
An amendment to the London Convention was adopted specifically to regulate marine geoengineering.
Right. And just to clarify for everyone listening, marine geoengineering at that time largely meant ocean iron fertilization,
Yes.
which is literally dumping tons of iron dust into the ocean to trigger massive algae blooms, right?
Yep.
Because they were hoping the algae would suck up carbon and sink to the bottom.
That was the theory, yes.
It was incredibly controversial because it could create massive dead zones in the ocean. So the London Convention steps in to make a legally binding framework to stop rogue actors from just dumping metal into the sea. That sounds like exactly what we need.
It sounds like it, but the reality is a complete structural failure. That 2013 amendment never even entered into force.
Wait, never?
Never. It failed entirely because it could not secure sufficient global ratifications.
So they wrote the rule book and everyone just ignored it.
The nations of the world simply ignored it. They signed the paper for the press release and then refused to ratify the binding commitments in their own legislatures.
That is, wow, that's incredibly bleak.
And this pattern of failure hasn't stopped. In fact, it has accelerated. This culminated recently in 2024 at the UN Environment Assembly, specifically UNES 6.
Okay, UNES 6, what happened there?
A crucial resolution was introduced by several vulnerable nations to finally establish global governance, oversight, and a comprehensive scientific assessment for solar radiation modification, or SRM.
And SRM is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, spraying reflective aerosols like sulfur into the stratosphere to bounce sunlight back into space, the ultimate existential panic button.
Precisely.
So the UN tries to finally put a leash on this in 2024. What happened? Did they pass it?
Instead of passing, the resolution was entirely withdrawn.
Withdrawn? They didn't even vote on it.
It collapsed due to unresolvable political gridlock. You had nations that wanted a strict non-use agreement clashing with nations that wanted to leave the door open for future deployment. So it was just pulled from the table.
That is unbelievable.
And that withdrawal didn't just delay the conversation. It created a massive, glaring regulatory void on the international stage.
Wait, let me just translate this into street language for a second, because the sheer absurdity of this needs to sink in. You're telling me I need to pull 3 different permits, hire an inspector, and pay a fee just to build a wooden shed in my backyard.
Yes.
But because the UN diplomats got into a shouting match and walked away from the table, the entire global atmosphere, the air that every living organism breathes, is just sitting there entirely unregulated.
That is the precise empirical reality of the situation.
Yeah.
There is no global sheriff.
That is terrifying.
And whenever you have a massive regulatory void combined with the existential panic of a warming planet, highly capitalized, profit-driven entities rush in to exploit the vacuum.
Right, because there's money to be made.
Exactly. According to the 2025 SRM 360 report authored by Josh Horton, this void is actively being filled right now by rogue commercialization.
Rogue commercialization. Give me names and numbers.
Horton's report explicitly documents that a private startup named Stardust Solutions recently secured $60 million in venture capital funding to advance their geoengineering operations.
Wait, $60 million.
Right.
Private venture capital.
Yes.
Not a government science agency, not an international consortium. We are talking about tech bros with a pitch deck getting $60 million to mess with the sky.
Exactly. And they operate on venture capital timelines.
Which means they want results yesterday.
Exactly. They require rapid deployment and proof of concept to secure the next round of funding. They are not interested in decades of careful ecological peer review.
Because that doesn't look good on a quarterly earnings report.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we have concrete, indisputable proof of the immediate danger this poses on U.S. soil.
This is where that EPA notice comes in, right?
Yes. We must look at the official enforcement notice issued by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on April 15th, 2025.
Okay, break that down for me. What did the EPA actually do?
This wasn't a warning about a hypothetical scenario. The EPA explicitly had to demand answers and issue notices to an unregulated geoengineering startup launching sulfur dioxide into the air.
I mean, it's like letting a rogue landlord set the apartment building on fire because he's trying out a new experimental heating system he bought off the internet, and the fire department is just standing in the parking lot arguing about what font to use in the rule book.
That is a highly accurate assessment of the structural dysfunction.
You, the listener, really need to stop and ask yourself right now, who exactly gave a private company with $60 million the consent to alter the sky above your own home? Did you vote for that?
The answer is nobody gave consent. The structural failure here is absolute. Because the international community cannot agree on rules, well-funded private actors are unilaterally turning the Earth's atmosphere into an unregulated, open-air laboratory.
And if we can't even agree on a rule book for the sky, look at the damage we're already projecting on the ground. Because when we talk about geoengineering, everyone instantly pictures the airplanes spraying stuff into the clouds.
Solar radiation modification, yes.
Right. But there's a whole other side to this ledger, the terrestrial, ground-based operations. And to me, this is where the cure looks almost as fatal as the disease.
Let's pivot to the ecological and economic costs. Let's talk about the sacrifice zones.
For this, we must audit the quantitative data provided by the 2024 Center for International Environmental Law, or SEAL, report.
Okay, the SEAL report. It provides a devastating look at the true, quantified cost of terrestrial geoengineering, specifically a technology called bioenergy carbon capture and storage.
Which is universally referred to as BECCS, right?
Yes, BECCS. BECCS.
Wait, let's break down BCCS for a second, because the math on this has always sounded insane to me. The stated goal here is to pull carbon out of the atmosphere.
Correct.
And the proposed mechanism is that you grow massive, massive amounts of biomass trees, switchgrass, crops. As they grow, they naturally suck CO2 out of the air through photosynthesis.
Yes, that is the bioenergy component.
Then you harvest all of it, transport it, burn it in a power plant to generate electricity, and somehow catch the exhaust smoke in the chimney, liquefy the carbon, and bury it deep underground.
That is the carbon capture and storage component.
I mean, it sounds like a great closed-loop system on a corporate whiteboard, but the sheer mechanics of it. What happens when you actually try to execute that on a planetary scale?
The 2024 SEAL report calculates exactly what happens. To capture just 12% of annual anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions using BECCS, we would need to convert over 170 million hectares of tropical grasslands into dedicated industrial biomass plantations.
Wait, stop. Say that number again.
170 million hectares.
170 million hectares. Give me some geographical context for that number so we can visualize this.
170 million hectares is roughly the size of the entire nation of Libya.
Libya.
Yes, it is the 16th largest nation in the world by landmass.
Oh my God.
We would be completely eradicating incredibly diverse tropical ecosystems, destroying native flora and fauna, displacing local populations, and replacing it all with sterile, fast-growing monoculture crop plantations.
And that unimaginable scale of destruction is just to make a 12% dent in global emissions.
Just 12%, yes.
Hold up, just to make a 12% dent. So to save the environment, our master plan is to literally pave over a piece of land the size of Libya with a sterile corporate monocrop.
That is what the data dictates.
And we haven't even talked about the water required to grow crops the size of a country, or the fossil fuels required to run the tractors to harvest it, or the energy required to compress the carbon and pump it underground. That's not a climate solution, that's a protection racket. You are destroying the earth on the ground to claim you are saving the earth on a spreadsheet.
The contradiction is staggering. The solution replicates the exact same extractivist colonial mindset that caused the climate crisis in the first place.
It's just digging the hole deeper.
And the data gets significantly worse, significantly more toxic, when we examine another highly touted terrestrial method, biochar.
Okay, biochar. I've heard this word thrown around a lot by green tech startups. Explain the mechanism here.
Biochar involves taking organic waste matter and subjecting it to pyrolysis.
Pyrolysis. Break that down.
Pyrolysis is the process of burning organic material at very high temperatures in an environment with almost zero oxygen.
Zero oxygen, so it doesn't actually catch fire.
Exactly. Because there is no oxygen, the material doesn't combust into ash and release all its carbon dioxide into the air. Instead, it bakes down into a highly stable form of charcoal. The theory is that you can then plow this charcoal back into agricultural fields, permanently trapping the carbon in the soil while supposedly improving crop yields.
Right, so you're turning waste into carbon-trapping fertilizer. That sounds nice. But what kind of waste are we talking about? To do this on a scale that actually affects global climate change, you can't just be burning yard trimmings from a suburban neighborhood.
Exactly. The scale requires industrial feedstock. The Peel report notes that to achieve idealized deployment of biochar technology at a scale that actually impacts the global carbon budget, it would require harvesting and processing 25% of all cattle manure and 90% of all pig and poultry manure on the entire planet.
Wait, 90%?
90% of the world's pig and poultry waste.
The logistics of just collecting, transporting, and storing mountains of biological waste on that scale are terrifying. I mean, just the smell alone.
But wait. It's not just animal manure they want to use, right? Because municipalities are looking at this as a way to get rid of human waste, too.
Correct. Municipal sewage sludge. And this is where the mechanism of pyrolysis becomes incredibly dangerous to local communities.
Tell me about it.
The Sea Isle report cites a very specific, deeply alarming permit application in Saratoga, New York.
Saratoga, New York. Okay.
A company proposed building a biochar facility that would use municipal sewage sludge as its primary feedstock. They requested legal permission from the state to emit lethal toxins directly into the surrounding community's air.
Because the audience needs to understand the paradox here. If you bake toxic city sewage to make green carbon-capturing charcoal, all the heavy metals and chemicals that people flush down the drain don't just magically disappear.
No, they do not break down. When you boil away the water and the organic matter at high temperatures, what happens to the toxins? They concentrate, and they get pumped right out the smokestack into the neighborhood. What exact toxins were on this permit application?
The requested emission permits explicitly included PFAS.
Oh, PFAS.
Yes, which are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly known as forever chemicals, because they do not break down in the human body or the environment.
Right.
The permit also requested the right to emit naphthalene, arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and hydrogen fluoride.
Oh my God, arsenic, mercury. So, under the guise of green technology and saving the planet, a corporation filed paperwork to legally pump arsenic, lead, mercury, and forever chemicals into the lungs of people living in a town in New York.
Yes, this is the precise academic definition of a sacrifice zone.
It's a sacrifice zone. That is so dark.
The underlying mechanism of terrestrial geoengineering does not actually stop pollution at its source. It merely changes its state and its location. It takes diffuse global carbon emissions and transforms them into localized heavy metal and chemical toxicity.
And historically, who lives next to these industrial processing plants? It is almost always vulnerable, rural, and indigenous populations.
Precisely. Geoengineering, in this form, fundamentally entrenches existing neo-colonial power dynamics where marginalized communities are forced to pay the physical, biological price in their own bloodstreams to offset the excess emissions of the wealthy.
So if we look at the terrestrial ledger, the ground-based solutions, we are looking at destroying biodiversity across land masses the size of sovereign nations, hoarding the world's biological waste, and creating toxic sacrifice zones where we pump heavy metals into neighborhoods.
That is the verified data, yeah.
That's the ground strategy. If we're already willing to accept that level of collateral damage to clean up our mess on the Earth, what happens when a rogue nation decides the ground isn't enough and looks back up at the sky?
This is where the models become truly catastrophic.
Let's move from the ground into the stratosphere, because this is where the audit gets genuinely apocalyptic.
We need to examine a deeply alarming concept introduced in a recent, highly detailed scientific preprint published in Geosphere on January 5, 2026.
January 2026. Okay, what does the preprint say?
The researchers here aren't just looking at the primary effects of geoengineering. They are modeling a secondary scenario involving counter-climate intervention, or CCI. Specifically, a tactic called stratospheric aerosol scrubbing, or SAS.
Counter-climate intervention, meaning intervening against an intervention.
Precisely. Let's walk through the mechanics of the scenario. The simulation models a situation where one rogue actor, perhaps a single nation experiencing devastating heat waves, unilaterally decides it cannot wait for the UN anymore.
Right, because UNIA 6 collapsed, so they're on their own.
Exactly. It decides to unilaterally cool the planet by deploying solar aerosol injection.
And to explain how that works for the listener, they aren't inventing a new scientific phenomenon. They are trying to artificially mimic a massive volcanic eruption.
Yeah, the Pinatubo effect.
Right. When a volcano like Mount Pinatubo erupted in the 90s, it blasted millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Up there, it mixes with water vapor to form tiny aerosol particles. These particles act like billions of microscopic mirrors, reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space before it can hit the Earth and warm the surface. So this rogue nation decides to play volcano. How much are they pumping up there?
The Geosphere paper uses a baseline computational model of injecting 12 teragrams of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere every single year.
12 teragrams. Okay, a teragram is 1,000,000 metric tons. So we are talking about 12 million metric tons of sulfur continuously pumped into the upper atmosphere every single year.
Yes. Now, the atmosphere is an unimaginably complex, chaotic system. You cannot inject 12 million tons of sulfur over one hemisphere without catastrophic unintended consequences globally.
What kind of consequences?
The models show that this unilateral injection could shift global monsoon patterns, potentially triggering severe, multi-year droughts in neighboring regions, effectively destroying the agricultural base of a rival nation.
Wait, So Nation A engineers the weather to cool their cities, and as a direct result, the rain stops falling on Nation B and all their crops die.
Exactly. So the study models what happens when Nation B, the rival actor or a contingency force, retaliates.
Retaliates how? Do they bomb the air bases?
They don't retaliate with traditional military force or bombs. They retaliate with chemistry.
Chemistry.
Yes. To stop the artificial cooling that is destroying their agriculture, they deploy stratospheric aerosol scrubbing. They attempt to neutralize the sulfur. The model shows them injecting 6 teragrams of calcite per year into the atmosphere to scrub or cancel out the 12 teragrams of sulfur.
This is madness. I mean, it's like taking a massive dose of uppers, realizing your heart rate is exploding, and instead of going to the hospital to pump your stomach, you just take a massive dose of downers, and you sit there hoping your body doesn't tear itself apart in the crossfire.
That is exactly what this is.
Let's look at the mechanics of the scrubbing. They are using calcite.
Yes, calcite is essentially a form of calcium carbonate. It is a highly alkaline mineral.
So it's basically like taking an antacid for heartburn. The atmosphere is highly acidic from the 12 million tons of sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain and destroys the ozone layer, right?
Correct.
So Nation B decides to dump 6 million tons of alkaline chalk into the sky to try and neutralize the acid. It's a chemical turf war in the stratosphere.
The analogy of an antacid is scientifically apt, but you are performing this neutralization blindly at altitudes of 60,000 feet within jet streams that circle the globe. You are profoundly compounding the instability of a complex, chaotic system.
And presumably just getting all that chalk up there is impossible anyway.
Beyond the chemical risks, the physical logistics required to maintain this atmospheric war are staggering.
Right, because you can't just load this stuff into a commercial Boeing 747. The stratosphere is too high.
Exactly. Commercial jets fly in the troposphere.
Yeah.
To reach the stratosphere, you need highly specialized, high-altitude aircraft capable of carrying immense payloads.
So how many planes do you need for this war?
According to a 2024 study by Smith, which is cited directly in the EG Sphere preprint, the logistics are almost insurmountable. Just delivering a fraction of the required chemicals, merely 0.5 teragrams per month, would require a fleet of approximately 220 specialized aircraft running continuous, nonstop global operations.
220 specialized planes. Think about the ground logistics of that. The fuel consumption, the maintenance crews, the turnaround times on the tarmac, the airspace conflicts.
It's an unprecedented military-industrial mobilization.
You have 220 planes flying 20/47 indefinitely, burning millions of gallons of jet fuel just to dump 6 million tons of chalk to cancel out the 12 million tons of sulfur the other guy is spraying. What happens if the scrubber chemicals, the calcite, have their own side effects? What if it triggers a different kind of atmospheric heating? Do we just send up a third fleet with a third chemical? Where's the escalation end?
It doesn't end. It is a compounding loop of systemic dysfunction. We are modeling a near-future scenario where sovereign countries effectively go to war with the climate itself, utilizing the Earth's atmosphere as a literal theater for chemical combat.
It represents a total systemic crisis of human governance.
Yes.
And surely the public must be aware of this trajectory, right? I mean, you cannot build a fleet of 220 specialized planes, run continuous global sorties, spray 18 million combined tons of chemicals into the sky, block out the blue sky, and not have the public ask questions.
You would expect severe public scrutiny, yes.
Which brings us to a massive contradiction. How is society actually processing this information right now?
Society is processing it through a lens of profound, paralyzing, and largely justified distrust.
Where's the data on this?
For the quantitative evidence of this social fracture, we must look at a monumental study published on March 17, 2023 in the iScience Journal. This was a rigorous academic analysis funded by the EU Horizon 2020 ERC grant 951542.
Okay, EU funded, what did they do?
The researchers conducted a massive data scrape of social media to understand public perception. They analyzed exactly 814,924 English-language tweets containing the hashtag geoengineering over a 13-year period, from 2009 to 2021.
Over 800,000 tweets over more than a decade. I mean, anyone who has spent 5 minutes looking at social media algorithms knows that when you scrape that much data on a controversial topic, you aren't going to find calm, peer-reviewed debates.
Definitely not.
What did the network mapping actually show?
It showed a complete breakdown of rational information exchange. The study identified massive spillover effects from existing conspiracy theories. Specifically, the chemtrails conspiracy.
Okay, for the listener who might not be deep in these forums,
Hmm.
the chemtrails theory alleges that the condensation trails left by normal commercial jet engines are actually chemicals being secretly sprayed by the government or global elites to poison the population, control the weather, or manipulate minds.
Yes, that is the core of the theory.
It's been around for decades, so how did this interact with actual geoengineering science?
The researchers proved that this specific online toxicity has completely consumed and dominated public perception of geoengineering across multiple major democracies, specifically the UK, the USA, India, and Sweden.
So it's not just an American problem.
No, it's a global phenomenon. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between a Harvard paper on solar radiation modification and a forum post about mind control chemicals. It all blurs together. The study concludes that this online toxicity directly shapes and ultimately paralyzes both anti-geoengineering and pro-geoengineering discourse alike.
The public sphere is entirely contaminated.
Entirely.
So the conversation is completely poisoned before the science even gets off the ground. You have actual climate scientists trying to explain the risks of the 2013 London Convention, and they are getting drowned out by millions of posts claiming the airlines are poisoning the water supply.
Yes.
But what's terrifying is that this isn't just staying on the internet anymore, is it?
No, it has breached the digital divide. This online toxicity has translated directly into bizarre, highly reactionary political gridlock in the real world.
Give me some examples of this gridlock.
Drawing from the 2025 SRM 360 article and examining specific legislative documents like Florida's CSCSS B56, we can see the political fragmentation clearly quantified.
Florida is involved.
Yes. Right-wing movements, specifically those aligned with the Mangier base, and state legislatures in Tennessee under bills SB 2691 and HB 2063, as well as lawmakers in Louisiana and Florida, have pushed to legally ban geoengineering outright within their state borders.
You're banning it outright.
And they are doing this entirely based on these chemtrail fears.
Think about the absolute fracture of reality we are looking at. You have state governments passing binding legislation to ban a vast international scientific intervention, but they are doing it to appease voters who think commercial Delta flights are spraying mind control dust.
Precisely. It is legislation driven by paranoia.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, on the exact opposite end of the political and economic spectrum, you have billionaire tech oligarchs like Elon Musk publicly exploring and funding actual SRM technologies to prevent global warming.
The contradictions are just dizzying.
You have a paralyzed international community, rogue billionaires funding startups, and state legislatures passing laws based on internet forums. It creates an unnavigable political paralysis.
It's total gridlock. But, I want to push back on the academic elite here for a second.
Okay.
Because scientists often look at the public and ask, why are they so paranoid? Why don't they trust our peer-reviewed papers? But people don't just wake up and decide the sky is poisoning them without some kind of seed being planted. They look at the track record of giant corporations.
The seed of paranoia is planted by observing actual, verifiable corporate behavior. As an investigative audit, we must impartially report the existence of specific corporate maneuvers that fuel this public distrust.
Like what?
For instance, we can look at the U.S. Patent Registry. There is U.S. patent number 7851676.
Patent number 7851676.
Got it. This is a verifiable, legally binding patent originally owned by Monsanto, the massive agrochemical giant. It is a stress tolerance plant patent. It specifically engineers crop seeds to survive extreme, highly degraded environmental conditions like cold, drought, salty soil, and crucially, heavy metal contamination.
Okay, let me stop and be exceptionally clear here for you, the listener. We are strictly, impartially reporting the contents of the sources provided for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing the conspiracy theory that massive corporations are secretly funding atmospheric geoengineering to intentionally poison the soil with heavy metals just so they can sell you their patented, genetically modified resistant seeds. We are not taking a side on the politics. But we are reporting that this specific patent for heavy metal resistant crops exists in the real world.
Correct. The existence and contents of U.S. Patent 7851676 are documented facts. And the Cambridge study shows that these facts are actively, constantly used by online communities as proof to fuel the paranoia.
They just connect the dots, however wild the connections might be.
Exactly. The structural social cost here is immense. You cannot safely democratically or effectively deploy a global, civilization-altering technology when the public discourse is fundamentally broken.
It's impossible.
The supreme contradiction of the geoengineering movement is that the scientific elite and international bodies constantly demand public engagement and consent in their reports. But the actual public is deeply, and perhaps irreparably, suspicious of that same scientific elite, and they are viscerally suspicious of the unaccountable billionaires funding the research.
The scientists are shocked, just absolutely shocked, that the public doesn't trust them to manage the Earth's thermostat. But when you look at the actual ledger of history, when you see billionaires funding rogue startups with $60 million to literally block out the sun outside of UN oversight.
Like Stardust Solutions.
Right. And agrochem giants hold actual patents for plants designed to survive heavy metal fallout, and biochar companies are applying for permits to pump PFAS into New York neighborhoods. Can you honestly blame the average person on the street for looking at this entire system and thinking the game is rigged against them?
From a sociological and historical standpoint, the public's reaction is not an anomaly. It is an entirely predictable, rational response to an opaque, profit-driven system that has repeatedly, for over a century, externalized its ecological damages onto the poorest segments of the populace.
Okay, we have audited the sky, the ground, the laws, and the internet. We need to bring this all together into a final tally. Give me the ultimate black assessment of geoengineering based on these sources.
The Black Assessment is an audit of terminal compounding dysfunction. Based entirely on the empirical data, geoengineering is not a solution to climate change. It is a symptom of a deeply entrenched, fossil fuel-addicted global system that refuses to cure its core disease.
It's just treating the symptoms with toxic medicine.
Exactly. The numbers dictate an unmitigated disaster across every metric. The terrestrial cost demands the destruction of 170 million hectares of diverse ecosystems for BCCS plantations.
An area the size of Libya.
Yes. The localized social cost demands the poisoning of vulnerable rural communities with PFAS, arsenic, and lead via municipal biochar production. The global governance cost is a total regulatory vacuum ruled by rogue, profit-seeking startups operating on venture capital timelines.
Unregulated capitalism in the sky.
And the geopolitical cost is a literal atmospheric arms race, modeling 220 specialized aircraft continuously spraying 18 million tons of sulfur and calcite to violently cancel each other out in the stratosphere, while the public sphere descends into conspiratorial paralysis and legislative gridlock. The balance sheet is entirely, irrevocably in the red.
Go to bankruptcy.
There's no positive yield here. There's only escalating risk.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? I want to break down the wall between the academic data and your daily life, because the most terrifying part of this entire deep dive is that this isn't some dystopian science fiction novel set in the year 2100.
No, the dates we discussed are current.
This is happening right now, today. The U.S. EPA was issuing enforcement violations to rogue sulfur startups in April 2025. The states are passing legislative bans right now. The tech bros have the $60 million in their bank accounts right now. The UN has already walked away from the table.
The trajectory is currently locked in. It is driven by ecological desperation and immense private capital, and it is operating entirely outside the bounds of democratic oversight, international law, or basic ecological safety.
I want you to think back to that analogy we used at the very beginning of the deep dive. The Hail Mary pass filled with lead smashing through our own windows. We are watching the architects of the climate crisis try to sell us the sledgehammer they're going to use to fix the house.
A hammer that will undoubtedly hit the most vulnerable first.
I want to leave you with a final, very dark thought to mull over as you go about your day. Look at the lengths these institutions are willing to go to. If the people in power are willing to blot out the sun, if they are willing to permanently alter the natural color of the sky, and if they are perfectly willing to risk collapsing the entire global agricultural food web just to avoid doing the hard work of phasing out fossil fuels, what makes you think they won't eventually decide that you and your community are just acceptable collateral damage in their grand, uncontrolled experiment?